Welcome, everyone, to our forum on the Goldwater Rule. I'm Stephen Zanakis, and a member of the executive board of the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, CERL, at the University of Pennsylvania. On behalf of the center, I want to welcome you to our forum today. CERL is a nonpartisan interdisciplinary institute dedicated to preserving and promoting the rule of law in 21st century national security, warfare, and democratic governance. We draw from the study of law, philosophy, and ethics to tackle the difficult problems and questions that arise in contemporary transnational conflicts, as well as interstate challenges to democratic principles. I invite you all to peruse the blog and to read the articles and variety of issues in the fields of ethics, rule of law, and the preservation of democracy. To submit a question for today's talk, please use the Q&A feature found at the bottom of the window here. If you like, you can identify yourself, keep your questions topical and appropriate. Of course, anything that we see posted inappropriate language will be removed. It is my great pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's talk, Professor Jonathan Moreno, the David and Lynn Silfen University Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. His most recent books are Everybody Wants to Go to Heaven, but Nobody Wants to Die, Bioethics and the Transformation of Healthcare in America, co-authored with Penn President Amy Gutmann, and The Brain in Context, a pragmatic guide to neuroscience, written with neuroscientist Jay Shulkin. In fact, Professor Moreno had a ringside seat to much of what we're discussing today on the Goldwater Rule, and that I hope he'll share with you. Jonathan, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Steve. Never ask a professor to talk about his or her autobiography. In fact, I saw the original Fact magazine when I was a kid in 1964. I won't tell you how old. And because my father had a courtesy subscription from the publisher, Mr. Ginsburg, looked at that issue, and it made an impact, I must say. And then, of course, there was a lot of publicity after that. I was following the news. I want to join Steve in welcoming everyone. This is going to be a fantastic panel. We've got very eminent guests. I will introduce them in alphabetical order. Very briefly, because in the era of search engines, you can learn more about them online. And then I'll say a couple of words about that issue of Fact magazine and how we got to where we are today, more or less. So first, Ambassador Norman Eisen is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution. He served as special counsel to the House Judiciary Committee for the Trump impeachment from February 2019 to February 2020. He is the author of A Case for the American People, the United States versus Donald J. Trump, published in 2020. Welcome, Ambassador Eisen. Dr. Bandy X. Lee is a forensic psychiatrist and violence expert who taught at Yale School of Medicine and Yale Law School for 17 years. She is also president of the World Mental Health Coalition and the author of the textbook, Violence, and edited The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. 37 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess a president, and of Profile of a Nation, Trump's Mind, America's Soul, published in 2020. Welcome, Dr. Lee. Richard Painter is the S. Walter Ritchie Professor of Corporate Law at the University of Minnesota. He has previously served as the White House Counsel's Office as the Chief Ethics Lawyer for President George W. Bush. Richard Painter is a reporter for the American Law Institute's Principles of Government Ethics and is the author of American Nero, The History of the Destruction of the Rule of Law and Why Trump is the Worst Offender, published in 2020. Welcome, Richard Painter. Claire Pouncey is a psychiatrist and a philosopher of science. She is a past president of the Association for the Advancement of Philosophy and Psychiatry. She has been writing and speaking on the Goldwater Rule since 2007, among her other philosophical projects. And there it is. Thank you very much, Dr. Pouncey. She completed the MD PhD program at the University of Pennsylvania, also known as the One True University. Welcome, Claire Pouncey. Dr. Paul Sommergrad served as the 141st president of the American Psychiatric Association from 2014 to 2015. He is the psychiatrist in chief at Tufts Medical Center, the Dr. Francis X. Arkin Professor and Chair of the Department of Psychiatry, and a professor of medicine at the Tufts University School of Medicine, and chair of the Tufts Medical Center Physicians Organization. His scholarship includes over 150 peer-reviewed publications, book chapters, and other communications. He has also edited 3 books: The Textbook of Medical Psychiatry, Integrated Care in Psychiatry, and Primary Care Psychiatry. Welcome, Dr. Sommergrad and everyone. So back in 1964, the offbeat Fact magazine's September-October issue was called The Unconscious of a Conservative. I had to buy that on eBay, Claire. I didn't keep the original that I had when I was a kid. The editor-publisher, Ralph Ginsberg, opened the issue with a 19-page psychological essay that cited various facts, memoirs, and observations about Senator Barry Goldwater, followed by a number of excerpts from the survey results. This was, of course, during the campaign for president between Lyndon Johnson and Barry Goldwater. In response to the question whether Goldwater was fit to be president, 2,417 out of 12,356 responded. Of those, 657 said he was fit. 1,189 said he was not fit. And 571 said they didn't know enough to answer the question. Goldwater sued Ginsberg and the managing editor of Fact and was awarded $75,000 in 1969. Now, in 1973, Section 7 of the American Psychiatric Association's Principles of Medical Ethics was published. It states that, and I'm quoting, "A physician shall recognize a responsibility to participate in activities contributing to the improvement of the community and the betterment of public health." Section 7.3 then states, "It is unethical for a psychiatrist to offer a professional opinion," referring to an individual who is in the light of public attention or who has disclosed information about himself or herself through public media, "unless he or she has conducted an examination and has been granted proper authorization for such a statement." So this is a bare bones summary of the original incident and a couple of the items that followed. Our panelists will talk more about the American Psychiatric Association's response, known, of course, as the Goldwater Rule. First, I'd like to ask Bandy Lee to summarize her position on the rule.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. The Goldwater Rule refers to Section 7.3, as Dr. Moreno mentioned, of the Principles of Medical Ethics, with annotations especially applicable to psychiatry. It is our code of ethics. It's often considered only a prohibition, but as Alan Dyer, who was on the board that originally adopted the Goldwater Rule, has said, it is a principle, not a rule, and an affirmative obligation above all else. Here's why. In the preamble to our ethics, it says a physician must recognize responsibility to patients as well as to society. And Section 7 elaborates more on that by saying a physician shall recognize the responsibility to participate in activities contributing to the improvement of the community and the betterment of public health. And under Section 7 is Section 7.1, shortly before the Goldwater Rule, which says psychiatrists are encouraged to serve society by advising and consulting with the executive, legislative, and judiciary branches of government. So section 7.3 finally says, on occasion, psychiatrists are asked for an opinion about an individual who is in the light of public attention or who has disclosed information about himself or herself through the public media. In such circumstances, a psychiatrist may share with the public his or her expertise about the psychiatric issues in general. However, one may not offer a professional opinion unless he or she has conducted an examination and has been granted proper authorization for such a statement. Now, professional opinion is a legal phrase that has generally been interpreted as meaning diagnosis. So, on the whole, 7.3 is an affirmative obligation to educate the public when asked about a public figure, just without diagnosing. This is a reasonable principle since the public figure is not a patient. In fact, it goes without saying and was probably only included as a result of the political compromise that Dr. Moreno had mentioned. But I will remind you, the preamble of our ethics distinguishes between our responsibility to patients and our responsibility to society. There's this distinction between clinical psychiatry, which is our service to patients, and public health psychiatry, which is our duty to protect society from harm. Section 7.3 is about our responsibility to society, not a public figure as a patient, since there is no patient relationship. So finally, I'll make one note. As Dr. Moreno mentioned, I've taught at Yale Law School for 17 years, and the parallel with the legal profession is almost exact. A lawyer makes a distinction between personally representing a client and obtaining permission to speak about the specifics of a client's case, and speaking publicly about legal issues of public interest, including of public figures one is not representing. If there were a Goldwater Rule for the legal profession, a legal analyst would not be able to comment on any legal case of public interest unless he or she were personally representing the public figure as a client and has received consent to talk about the case. Obviously, this is not required, and the detriment to public education would be immense if this were not allowed. Hence, it does not make sense, in my view, to silence mental health experts on the plenty we can talk about in general without diagnosing, but bringing our training to bear on publicly available information, which is not confidential information. In fact, when there is a threat to public health, this would be required because of our direct responsibility to society. So to repeat, section 7.3 is clearly about public health, not clinical psychiatry. And so I will leave it there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. So Dr. Pouncey, you're a psychiatrist, a practicing psychiatrist, and a practicing philosopher of science. What's your take on the rule?
Well, I think Bandy summed up a lot of important distinctions to be made between the different roles of psychiatry, but there are some very interesting aspects of moral philosophy I want to touch on. You brought up that the annotations, the APA's annotations, actually keep intact the AMA Code of Ethics, which are phrased in form of principles. And each of those principles starts with the language, a physician shall. So they're very neutral wording that provide guidelines for physicians who are deciding what to do in a given situation. And they don't follow a specific code of ethics or fundamental moral philosophy. And it's done that way deliberately so that anyone who has religious tenets that they follow or a specific moral philosophy that they follow can still find these principles useful. They're neutral. The APA, in all its wisdom, when it formed these annotations, changed the wording of the annotation. So it kept the language of a physician shall for each of these sections. And it provided annotations because these guidelines with the neutral language, they said, have been difficult to interpret. Now, I don't know why they thought that would be true. Psychiatrists are pretty functional moral agents and adults, and they're not preschoolers who need to be told, not to take other people's snacks out of their cubbies. And sometimes moral questions are hard to grapple with, and that's just a true fact about living in society. But the APA thought that some individual psychiatrists might be having trouble grappling with these neutral principles. And so when they provided annotations, they provided a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them in the language of it is ethical or it is unethical too. So some of the things that they specifically said in the annotations are unethical are expressing a professional opinion publicly about a public figure. That's section 7.3, which I agree is not a rule, even though they say it is unethical. They also say it is unethical to sleep with a present or future patient, which during my training was fundamentally the wrong thing to do. And the one thing you could do wrong that would get you in a lot of trouble as a psychiatrist. Nobody ever mentioned speaking publicly about public figures at all during any of my training. And another thing that is considered absolutely unethical, according to the APA annotations, is practicing outside of one's professional competence, which, you know, makes sense, but that would be true for any medical professional or legal professional, I think. But then section 7.5, and you've now heard section 7 read by Dr. Lay. You've heard 7.1, which encourages psychiatrists to work with members of the government or maybe the CIA if you're Gerald Post and you do profiling to help the CIA. Section 7.3 has to do with speaking publicly about public figures. Section 7.5 says psychiatrists shall not participate in torture. So that's a pretty strong position that the APA stands by, and psychiatrists do not participate in torture. That's considered unethical, like sleeping with one's patients is unethical. But that's phrased in terms of psychiatrists shall not it is unethical, as if we're having trouble interpreting what to do in any given situation. So I think the choice of language is very instructive. And what's really interesting is that the APA or its ethics committee at any given time never provides any moral foundation for saying why what they admonish is unethical at all. So they don't say whether they're using any kind of virtue ethics or principalism or consequentialism. They just say, no, 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 don't do that. And they never say why, and they never give any basis for self-defense or rationalizing or justifying an individual psychiatrist's choice, which can be complicated because the world is complicated and people come to any moral choice with lots of different commitments based on their different roles in the world. So, so I find this really paternalistic on the part of the APA, and I don't take it to be binding because people still do what they do. What's really interesting is that in March of 2017, the APA Ethics Committee, in light of a lot of the controversy that came up with the Donald Trump presidency, they actually made an ethics committee formal opinion about what it is to give a professional opinion. And Bandy has spoken very eloquently about why the idea of a professional opinion doesn't fit well with what happens in medical ethics. But what they did was they made the section 7.3 more stringent by saying that what counts as a professional opinion from a psychiatrist can include not just diagnostic terminology, which has become so commonplace in ordinary language in this world. You know, everyone talks about Freudian terminology and Jungian terminology and reaction formations and narcissism, and everyone and their mother can talk about what might be mentally wrong with someone or wrong with their personality using this kind of language. It's not just psychiatrists or psychologists, so it's ordinary language anymore. But what happened is that the APA Ethics Committee said that any comment about the speech, behavior, affect, or any kind of public presentation of a public figure that draws on the skills or training or knowledge or expertise inherent in psychiatry, which could include just about anything, is now verboten. which is so stringent and silences just about anyone who takes Section 7.3 seriously, which I don't, although I have never spoken publicly about a public figure, because I don't think my opinion is all that important. The APA also feels very comfortable attributing to people who do speak publicly some sort of self-promotion and grandiosity. So I don't know why they think that would be true and why that isn't a violation of the Goldwater Rule. But I don't personally violate it because I don't think my opinion is that important. But they made it almost impossible for anyone who does want to avoid any kind of public sanction from saying anything about anybody. So if I were to remark on someone's wrinkled shirt, that could be construed as part of a formal mental status exam, you know, that they're disheveled. And inferences could be made on that just because it could be included as part of a psychiatric examination, and that would be included. So it's now become so broad and so strict, and yet it has no teeth. And that's the third thing I'm going to say, and then I want to be quiet. So the process for actually being sanctioned by the APA does not go through the national APA, which is where you know, all the hullabaloo happens. The ethics committee is part of the national APA. But if you want to make an actual criticism of someone and you want to bring them up on ethics charges, that happens at the district branch level. And it all happens in absolute secret. So you would write a letter, you would specify what the violation of 7.3 is, you would give evidence, and then everything happens hush hush, and no one's allowed to talk about it after that. So no one ever knows what the outcome is. And the only possible outcomes are being asked to leave the APA, which is not really that bad a punishment if you think about it, because many psychiatrists never become members of the APA, or you're asked to do some kind of educational project, which I assume is just reading. Perhaps Dr. Summergrad knows more about this. So with that said, I will return to you. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Pouncey, we are happy to have your opinion on these matters and don't agree that they don't count. And I have to say, with these number of psychiatrists looking at me on their screens, I'm a little self-aware about my wrinkled shirt now. Paul Summergrad, can you help us think about what was going on in American psychiatry? This is around a decade, from around 63, 64 to the early 1970s. Contextualize the discipline as it was in those days a bit for us. And no doubt you have your own view about the matters that Doctors Lee and Pouncey were just discussing. So would you help us out with context and you know, your own views?
Thank you. First of all, let me say, you know, just to be clear, I don't have a formal role with the American Psychiatric Association at this point. I'm a past president, but lots of people serve in that role, including the current chair of psychiatry at, as Dr. Moreno described at the One True University, Maria Kendo, who's the chair of psychiatry at Penn. You know, I think that let me take two different points of view here for a second. First, to what was going on in American psychiatry in the 1960s. And again, my apologies for joining you via phone. My computer and Wi-Fi picked an odd moment to go down. You know, American psychiatry was much, much smaller than it is currently. So there were, as you point out, somewhere around 13,000 members of the American Psychiatric Association. Population of the United States in 1964 was 194 million. It's now 330 something million. So the population's gone up by about 57%. Number of psychiatrists in the United States has probably trebled during that period. And in addition to that, there are a large number of psychologists, social workers, counseling psychologists, people who did not have substantial clinical roles in the same way in 1964 as they do now. So psychiatry, mental health, psychology has become much more of an environment within which we live than was true, I think, at that point. What was true, I think, in American psychiatry at that point, it was probably the apex of the influence of psychoanalysis. Many chairs of psychiatry in major universities in the United States were psychoanalysts. And while if you had really looked closely and carefully at a whole host of things that were going on in psychiatry, starting with the discovery of chlorpromazine in 1954, with Don Klein's work using imipramine for panic disorder in 1959, there was a whole new psychiatry that was about to emerge. There was nevertheless a tendency to view psychiatry and to some degree psychoanalysis as one and the same thing. And that one could really make, if you will, ex cathedra kinds of pronouncements with very limited information about people that one had, some public limited information about, but that were nevertheless quite could be quite critical, could be quite judgmental, or in any event, went way beyond any kind of reasonable standard or boundary that one could consider, I think, appropriate from my standpoint. So I think the Goldwater Rule in part emerged out of that period of time. Now, one of the challenges that has occurred since that time is that as American psychiatry attempted to become more reliable and scientific, the DSM-3 in particular, which was instituted after the Goldwater Rule, and came out of a lot of work at a number of universities, including Washington University in St. Louis, really attempted to find, in a sense, more reliable criteria to at least nevertheless study psychiatric illness. And there's a whole long literature and a whole long reason why that's the case. But it also has tended to confuse, I think, the nature of what psychiatric evaluation is. And is tended to make psychiatric evaluation, if you will, identical with or nearly identical with what are presumably generally observable behavioral phenomena. And that's a misunderstanding in my view and a misnomer, and frankly, it's a mistake. And what makes mental disorders mental is not their cause, it's their symptoms. And the etiologies of mental disorders, you mentioned the book I wrote, Textbook of Medical Psychiatry, can be due to a whole host of medical, neurologic, other conditions that are not necessarily immediately observable based on simply looking at observable behavior. And consequently, I think one needs a little reasonable degree of humility in approaching the diagnosis of even somebody that one has seen. One always needs to start out with the presumption that there may be no diagnosis. And if there is a diagnosis, like the rest of clinical medicine, there may be a very, very long and broad differential diagnosis. And the predictive value, what Bayes' theorem, which is that things that are rare are harder to test for, or as we sometimes say in clinical medicine training, when you hear hoofbeats, don't think of zebras. It requires us to have, again, I think, a sense of perspective, humility, and frankly, restraint. And if there's anything I think it's fair for me to say about the Trump presidency is that there was a lack of restraint and a loss of restraint and a loss of norms. And consequently, I think it's really important that we make sure that as we approach the problems of the Trump presidency, we think about them both broadly and we think about them from the standpoint of what our obligations and duties are, not just what we might like to see as potential outcomes. So in any event, that's my view of the context.
Thank you. So we are going from a Goldwater candidacy to a Trump presidency, and I'd like to ask Richard Painter and Norm Eisen to talk a little bit about the 25th Amendment, the problems of succession, and how they tied into the evaluations that were made by many psychiatrists or at least some psychiatrists about the former president. Richard Painter, would you get us started?
Well, I would like to put this discussion in the framework of what was happening in the 1960s. Because yes, the Goldwater Rule was a reaction in the psychiatric profession to what had happened in the 1964 election. But in the 1964 election, a critically important issue was the Cold War and the possibility of nuclear war. I was only 2 years old during the Cuban Missile Crisis when we came to the brink of nuclear war. And it's a legitimate question for the American people of who do we want sitting there in the Situation Room with the ability to destroy human civilization in 20 minutes. We saw John F. Kennedy in action. Lyndon Johnson was the president after Kennedy was assassinated, and the question is who should come next. The psychiatrists interviewed in that news report may or may not have been right about risks associated with Barry Goldwater and some of his rhetoric. But nonetheless, this was a critically important issue, and the survival of human civilization depended upon it. That is why.
Sorry, somebody had their mic on. Go ahead, Richard.
After the, am I still blocking?
You're still with us. Apologies.
Yeah. After the assassination of President Kennedy, it became that much more critical to think about the question of succession in the case not only of the president being assassinated or dying of natural causes in office, but a president who was physically incapacitated or mentally incapacitated, as we had during the last year of the Woodrow Wilson administration. How do we deal with that problem when we have nuclear weapons? And that is why the 25th Amendment is drafted the way it is, allowing the cabinet, the majority of the cabinet with a vice president, to temporarily remove the president, notify Congress, for Congress to make the decision about what to do about a president who is physically or mentally incapacitated. The 25th Amendment also allows Congress to establish a separate body that to which that function would be delegated. Congress has not done that. Norm Eisen and I, in our chapter for Bandy Lee's book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, discussed various proposals, including one by my good friend Jamie Raskin, congressman from Maryland, on how we could establish such a body that would advise Congress of whether the president should be removed from mental incapacity. But my point here is that this is a critical issue, a question upon which the survival of human civilization may depend. If we have someone who is mentally unfit for office, either in the White House or in the Kremlin or a major world power, or someone who is incapable psychologically of dealing with the emotions and the overreactions and everything else we may have from other superpowers. We have another Cuban Missile Crisis. We do care, and our lives depend on who's in the White House. So for me, what is shocking here is that the psychiatric profession headed in one direction, pulling psychiatrists seeking to pull back from the public dialogue about the mental health of the president or candidates for the presidency and other powerful positions, while Congress and our Constitution, through the 25th Amendment, moved in the other direction, saying that these are important issues, critically important, worthy of amending the United States Constitution. So I'm asking the psychiatric profession to join the public dialogue, bring your skills, your knowledge to bear on this question. I know the constitutional law. I know why we have the 25th Amendment and why the psychiatric condition of the president is so critically important to our country and to human civilization. But you, the psychiatrists, I ask you, please participate in this conversation. You may be right, you may be wrong, but in this situation, silence is definitely wrong.
Well, Richard
Painter, Norman Eisen, can you
yes,
elaborate?
Richard, as usual, has covered the waterfront brilliantly that we encompassed in our contribution to the blog series explaining why the Goldwater Rule is so out of touch and indeed inimical to the functioning of public discourse in our democracy. I'll only add a couple points, taking you up on your invitation, Jonathan, to go from Goldwater to Trump. The first is that there was an absolutely critical role that those like Dr. Lee, and indeed she was one of the leaders, an absolutely critical role that they played in alerting the nation, opinion leaders, and particularly the press to the severe dysfunctionality of the prior president. I don't add that reflection in any kind of a partisan or even a never Trump fashion. In fact, I provided ethics advice to the Trump transition, believing at the time that it was my responsibility as a patriotic American to assist whichever candidate might have succeeded. But because of a series of increasingly worrying and frankly, often bizarre events, there was a need to reevaluate the fitness, to ask the question with increasing urgency about the fitness of the ex-president. And some of those who were who did that were from outside the psychiatric profession. You're brilliant. He's also a Philadelphian, the brilliant philanthropist, Dan, and attorney, Dan Berger. I commend to all of you his column in the Huffington Post from the election season, actually, in which he warned of just the type of aberrational behavior that we saw when the president was in office. But then I vividly remember events, and Richard and I wrote about it in our submission for the blog series, events like Dr. Ronnie Jackson, who later ran for Congress with Trump's endorsement, speaking to Donald Trump's fitness. And then thank goodness we had Dr. Lee to speak out publicly to say, no, Dr. Jackson did not perform an adequate evaluation of the question. And I believe that the contribution that Bandy and so many others who were willing, whether bound by it or not, so many others who were willing to speak out about this question, really, I think, made a difference in how the press and the public viewed the former president, and enabled them to very candidly assess his increasingly dangerous behavior. And just the phenomena that were warned of transpired, of course, in and around the time of the presidential election and afterwards, when the characteristics that Dr. Lee and her colleagues warned us of led to one of the most dangerous moments in American history. The first time in the history of our country, just what Dr. Lee had been signaling about for so many years, the first time in the history of our country that we did not have a peaceful transition of power. Precisely, I believe, in part because of the issues that Dr. Lee raised. And thank goodness, because that 4-year effort paid off. And for the first time, the press did not simply say, well, the one side claims the election was legitimate and the president claims it was stolen, but they were able to identify just the nature of the president's adherence to the big lie and the kind of profoundly disturbed thinking and behavior that we saw. So I think the nation owes a great debt to those who spoke out about these issues. Of course, it wasn't only psychiatrists, and all of this, as Richard has said, as we write in our contribution, all of these are the reasons we were fortunate that we somehow survived the past 4 years, but we may not be so lucky the next time. And the Goldwater Rule must not be allowed to muzzle that critical contribution that we look to mental health professionals, to psychiatrists, to make as part of that discourse that brought us through this very difficult 4 years. So
I think
Paul Summergrad, would you like to?
Yeah, I think the challenge is that we're conflating two different problems. And so let me speak to Richard's point, because I think he said it most clearly. There's no, and Steve Zanakis wrote this in the Boston Globe in 2018, where we called specifically for Congress to enact not only the other body that's called for in Section 4 of the 25th Amendment, but also called for there to be rules, guidelines, procedures, obviously membership of that body that would be critical to deal with exactly these issues, precisely because the infirmity of leaders is foreseeable. Not just psychiatric infirmity, medical infirmity. And we know throughout American history that the medical illnesses of leaders has been hidden from the American people. Woodrow Wilson, John F. Kennedy, Frank Leahy in Massachusetts, who was the surgeon who founded the Leahy Clinic, evaluated Franklin Roosevelt in 1944, said he shouldn't run again, said he would die early in his next term. And that letter was placed in his lawyer's office in a safe in Boston and not revealed until 3 years ago. So the challenge is not that psychiatrists don't have a role to play for an appropriately constituted group, but the problem is that putting it into a set of criteria or communications that are as likely to be politically utilized as they are to be reasonably close to medical reality is problematic. I completely agree. We need processes to deal with this. No one that I know of disagrees with that construct. The problem is not, do we need that? The problem is, how do we do that? And in my view, the failure here is a failure of the Article I branch, which has the authority, the ultimate authority, and obviously the cabinet and the vice president under the 25th Amendment to deal with this. Now, you can make an argument around other components of this, but this is not an argument about whether we need a capability of evaluating the medical well-being of presidents. We absolutely do. The problem is using this kind of, John McCain in June of 2017 was in a hearing with Jim Comey and conflated the Russia evaluation and the email evaluation as related to Hillary Clinton. And he then put out a statement that night to I stayed up too late watching the Diamondbacks game. A month later, he had a blood clot removed from his frontal lobe. And there are quotes that I can give you from the New York Times of leading neurosurgeons saying, well, thank God it's only a blood clot. He should do well. He's out of the hospital in 2 days. My wife and I, who's also a physician, sat at home and said, that's an unusual place for a blood clot. That's not usually where you see subdural hematomas. They usually are in the lateral part of the brain when people fall. And I'm really worried something else is going on here. And 2 days later, and they put out very little information. And 2 days later, we found out he had a glioblastoma. So one needs a little bit of humility in dealing with these issues. These are not necessarily self-evident conclusions based on observable behavior alone. One needs more information from a medical standpoint to a reasonable degree of medical certainty. Not a perfect degree of medical certainty, but a reasonable degree of medical certainty.
Thank you, Paul Summergrad. I'm going to ask Steve Zanakis, since your name was taken in vain by our colleague Paul Summergrad, to weigh in as well. By the way, I'm also remembering, since I was a little older than Richard Painter at that time, that President Eisenhower and President Johnson both had cardiac trouble. And that must have also weighed on the drafters of the amendment, as it was not as widely reported as it might have been today. Steve Zanakis, and then we'll come up to, I think, Dr. Lee, did you want to weigh in as well? Steve Zanakis?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. And the other point is that President Eisenhower, as I recall the history, had his heart attack in 55 and then had a stroke in 57 and considered pulling himself, in fact, resigning as president, and decided was advised not to do that. And I'd like to think that as a general, he probably judged that he no longer had the capability to do what needed to be done. And it may have been how the whole conversation about the 25th Amendment started. But I think that part of in my role as an Army psychiatrist and as a general, there have been many times that I've been asked to make a judgment about someone's performance and conduct. All these questions have come up that you've heard. The difference has been that we've had a set of rules to play by. We've had a set of rules of guidelines. And in fact, if I was asked about particularly a senior officer who had the authority to launch missiles, if that person was competent to do that, there were the procedures that included an evaluation, and that officer could be evaluated for that evaluation. The difference here is there are no rules. One, we can't rely on the cabinet to particularly make a statement or initiate action if they think that a president is not able to perform his or her duty, and for any number of reasons. And I think Paul's been very eloquent in laying out all the different kinds of problems that we're going to possibly could arise. And then secondly, as our piece was titled in the Boston Globe, the Congress is AWOL, irrespective of the conversations that Representative Raskin and others have made. There are no procedures. And so here we have the individual who has the authority with nuclear weapons and may have been questioned. I mean, I remember reading, I never was able to confirm it, that Secretary Mattis sent out a directive saying, if you get this kind of order from the White House, don't follow it. But there are no rules here. So that forces us in our positions, I think, as physicians, to understand that there must be a way to exercise a voice to engage the public in this conversation, and for there to be action either from the Congress or the executive branch that would enable us to evaluate someone and ascertain if they've maintained the competence and capability to act in their role and carry out their duties. I think that puts us in a very different position than almost any other figure, because the president is so unique. And the president is essentially shielded, can be shielded by the cabinet, and there are not rules to follow. So that may mean that we as physicians and senior physicians and spokesmen now have to exercise a voice in a very different way to focus some attention on this. So I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. Anyone else in the panel? We've got some fabulous questions, but we have a few minutes before we're supposed to get into questions. Bandy Lee.
Yes, I just wanted to say that we didn't have a formal procedure left out, but we did have a rudimentary sense of what our professional limitations are, what the parameters are. I myself, as a forensic psychiatrist, have consulted with dozens of courts and at least a dozen governments in the past. And so my question rather is why the APA itself diverged from its fiduciary duty to follow its own ethical guidelines. When we were invited to speak with Congress members, and we eventually met with over 50 of them, they thought that our ability to educate the public was the key to their intervening in ways that were necessary. And as you pointed out, we had the media on board. The public was very eager to hear from us. And this was precisely when the APA intervened publicly attacking us and slandering us as being armchair psychiatrists, using psychiatry as a political tool, and doing this for self-aggrandizing reasons, even though we were following the guidelines for consultation according to section 7.1, that we serve society by consulting with the various branches of government. And we were artificially shut down from the major media within weeks of their intervention because they were so aggressive in calling us out as unethical and not to be listened to. And why the APA did not follow its own procedure for ethics committee investigations, which as Dr. Pouncey mentioned, are done very carefully and confidentially, but rather came out in public calling us things that it had no way of knowing our intentions around this. And I believe that there is also a duty that we refrain from speaking about things we do not have enough information about. And I would agree on that as far as diagnoses go, because diagnosis requires all medical records. It requires an intimate examination, although not always a personal interview since DSM-3. But there are certain things that we can know about, such as dangerousness and potential unfitness, in which case we're in every other circumstance required to act if we have enough information. And many of my colleagues have said they have far more information on the previous president than any patient they've ever treated. And why to pretend that we do not have this information also, in my view, is duplicitous and somewhat placing self-protection over our societal responsibility. And the other question is the conflicts of interest that the APA has. Can the APA make rules and regulations about the figures and governmental bodies it lobbies? In fact, since the very beginning of the ethics guideline change in March 2017, a high-ranking official had actually confessed that they strengthened the Goldwater Rule against the direction of science and evolving practice and also ethical reasoning because they were interested in protecting federal funding. So there's evidence that the APA has, in fact, bucked the trend of most scientific and educational organizations, that it has seen an unprecedented rise, increases in federal funding, even compared to the press releases it had shown prior to its intervention, and whether this kind of thing should be allowed. And in my view, the detriment to the public was enormous, because since early 2020, by March 2020, we put out even a prescription for survival that if this president were kept in place, if he were allowed the influence that he was being given, that there would be an unacceptable rate of unnecessary deaths from COVID-19. And that's exactly what has transpired, according to the Lancet Commission, according to the Columbia University study. And so this was all that we could predict and foresee based on our experience of hundreds of patients who have a similar personality structure as he does, on decades of research that we could apply to this situation on an evidence-based basis without diagnosing irresponsibly, and why this was blocked by the APA, whereas in fact, those who egregiously violated the Goldwater Rule by irresponsibly diagnosing, and I won't name names, but a past APA president especially is getting to be known to have done this, the APA has kept silent about, because he
Jeff
gave—
Lieberman.
Yes, Jeffrey Lieberman. Yeah. He has written scores of articles basically clearing the past former president of any psychiatric problems. Now, ruling out is a diagnosis just as much as ruling in. And that kind of irresponsible diagnosis was allowed to go on because it was advantageous to the president, whereas those of us who are conscientiously raising our voices, expressing mere concern, were aggressively silenced.
Norman Eisen, I think you wanted to comment as well.
I did. I just wanted to add that certainly there's a role for the political branches, but to put a sharper point on Bandy's comment, I think it misconceives the functioning of American democracy to say, oh, let's leave it to Congress. Richard and I wrote that Congress ought to exercise its authority, its capacity under the 25th Amendment to establish a statutory body to aid it with its determinations of presidential incapacity. But in a democracy, there is an absolutely critical role, I would argue, a fundamental role for public opinion, for the views of the people. Congress, in its determinations, and other political actors rely on that and to an extent represent that. So unless we have the most qualified individuals opining on these critical matters of national import, and none could be more critical than the mental health of the president, the system won't function. That's why the work of Dr. Lee and her colleagues was so important to the past 4 years. It made a material contribution. Of course, it comes with a certain amount of controversy, dispute, and cost, but it's a price well worth paying for the preservation of democracy. And our democracy cannot function if we, on this issue, we starve the public of the oxygen of expertise, which is what Dr. Lee and those like her so courageously provided over the past 4 years. We must repair this dangerous Goldwater Rule to make sure that we have that in the future.
Paul Summergrad, and then
Yes.
Claire Pouncey.
So there's a lot of different places to potentially talk about. Let me just take a few. Nothing in the Goldwater Rule, nothing in the AMA ethics rules, which now mirror the Goldwater rules, which refrain from making clinical diagnoses about individuals in the public sphere they have not had the opportunity to personally examine. Basically, very similar. Nothing prevents somebody from talking about the medical or the psychiatric or other consequences of the disclosed illness in general terms. Nothing prevents people from providing expertise around that. That's different than saying, I know that the following individual has X. And while we may, or somebody who doesn't like President Trump may say, gee, I'm really happy that we're talking about this now. Somebody who doesn't like President Biden can talk about X or Y or Z, and indeed, you don't have to go far to find such comments on Fox News or OAN or other kinds of individuals. When you open the door, you open the door. And so I think that there needs to be, again, we have a very real problem. We don't, and one of the things that President Trump did better than almost any other president is to show us all of the weaknesses in our constitutional order. He found all of the door jams where things were loose, and he could pry them further loose. And one could easily, nothing in the Goldwater Rule prevents somebody from describing a psychiatrist or otherwise describing the president as having, acting in an authoritarian manner, or as a tyrant, or as a undemocratic president. People are citizens; they're allowed to speak. It's when one begins to make and says, "I know," as a matter of reasonable medical certainty, that the following is the cause of this, and this is the following is the outcome. Well, that becomes a much more problematic issue for some of the reasons that I've indicated. Secondly, Carl Jung is reported apocryphally to have said, psychiatrists should never worry about giving advice because it has so little effect. If anyone really believes that 1,000 psychiatrists who trend liberal, jumping up and down and saying President Trump was X or Y or Z, would change the direction of American democracy when we have people who are denying the exact thing that happened on January 6th when they were there, I think underestimates the severity of the political crisis that we're in. We're in a very, very significant political crisis, and we're not going to solve this by dealing with this from the standpoint of the Goldwater Rule. Finally, and let me just say this one other point. At some point, if there is a president who has a serious mental illness, and the White House or the Congress or the Vice President's office or the cabinet needs consultation about this, they are not going to seek consultation with people who have made public statements about people they haven't evaluated. They're going to want to bring in people who are neutral, expert opinion leaders around this. And people who've commented one way or the other, I think, put themselves and make themselves less available to exactly the people who will need help at the moment they will need it. And so I think that there's a real risk associated with that as well.
Yeah, could I just intervene on this though? Because I have opined as a lawyer on the ethics of Donald Trump and many things that he has done that I believe actually may violate various criminal statutes. By making those statements prior to the election, I have taken myself out of the running, perhaps, to participate in the prosecution of Donald Trump if the Justice Department were to take such action. That is clear, but there are many, many hundreds of thousands of lawyers in this country, and I'm sure thousands better qualified to actually conduct the prosecution of the president than I am. I served my role, I believe, along with many others who spoke out about the ethics of Donald Trump, his violation of criminal statutes, and a number of other things. I believe that's critically important to the discussion that we have with the American people. And I go back to the point that the mental health of the president and the mental health of those around him is as critically important as whether he follows the emoluments clause of the Constitution, the matter that I discussed ad nauseum with Norm Eisen on CNN, and then we filed a lawsuit and so forth. But I would suggest that we need the psychiatric profession. Not everybody, many, indeed most, may very well stand back and say nothing until they are called upon to serve on this commission, if Congress ever were to establish this commission we're talking about. But should not some psychiatrists have the freedom to speak their mind? And January 6th reminds us that the psychosis spreads, and this is a point that Bandy Lee made, the psychosis spreads. And that is what brings about the end of representative democracy. You just watch the old films of the Nuremberg rallies, what was happening in Germany in the 30s, and it wasn't just one man who was off. It was a good portion of an entire country. And this is a grave, grave risk. And I'm just asking the psychiatric profession to allow some of its members to speak up and participate in our democracy in this way.
There are some, Claire Pouncey.
It's not about allowing members. Members get to do whatever they want. The APA doesn't control us. We're adults. We get to do what we please. And Paul Summergrad, I think you are conflating a couple of things that need to be teased apart. We are allowed to speak in general terms with reference to a person, saying, if one shows these behaviors or wears this crinkled shirt, one might think this is going on. But if you're talking about dangerous behaviors and you say this particular person showed these behaviors, you're not making a diagnosis. And there's nothing wrong with saying that this person is doing this specific thing. The APA consistently conflates using diagnostic terminology and speaking about particular people as making diagnoses. And we know, because you just said so, that that is not what goes into a clinical diagnosis. When you're sitting down one-on-one with a particular patient, there's a lot more that goes into it, and there's much more information you need to get to make a psychiatric diagnosis. What happens when you're expressing concerns about public behavior of public figures is not diagnosis, though some of the terminology may overlap. And I think it is very important to make this clear because it is constantly misunderstood, including on this panel.
But look, the history of psychiatry has a lot of areas that are very, very problematic in it. If you look
Yes,
at the,
but we're in
no,
the
let me-
present, and shutting down debate
no,
is not the way to deal with history.
there's no shutting down debate. No one's forced to be a member of the APA. And
This is
frankly,
not about
I'm
the
not aware,
APA.
I'm
The
not
AMA
aware of,
rules say
and
that
I'm
all
not,
physicians should
Let's take
abide
one
by
at a
the
time,
code of
please.
medical
Just-
ethics. It's not about membership in the APA. It's about the message that is sent that individual psychiatrists can't function as moral agents.
they
The
can function
APA
as
met
moral.
with
Okay, wait,
and
I
Let's
think
let Dr. Sundergrad
specifically met
respond.
with media
then-
organizations to shut us down and for them to adopt
I'm not
informal
here, I'm not
policies
here.
not to have any mental health professionals on.
If you want to have a debate about the APA, please have a debate about the APA. I'm talking about what the challenges are in responding to an potentially ill president. That's what I'm talking about. And
You're
the reality is,
perpetuating
Let's
messages.
let him speak, please.
the reality is the history of psychiatry is unfortunately filled with many examples of the political use of psychiatry, starting with the Nazis. In 1935, 1933, the first group that were subject to extermination were individuals who had mental infirmities or mental, what was then called mental retardation, developmental disorders that psychiatrists participated in, and that the German Psychiatric Association, 50 years later, had to issue an appropriate apology for. The situation that occurred in the former Soviet Union with the use of psychiatry for political purposes. Psychiatry sits at a very unique boundary between general medicine and the law, where this is the only place where someone is given the authority, as far as I'm aware, to remove someone's liberties for reasons of mental disease or defect, where one doesn't get a more immediate kind of legal kind of review. It takes sometimes days, if not longer, depending on the state you're in. So we have a very particular obligation, in my view, to be very careful about this, number one. Number two, the duty to warn is a duty in every state that I'm aware of towards an individual patient where one has an individual first-party treatment relationship. If one wants to take on or create a duty where the average psychiatrist has a responsibility to declare the risks to the general public, and that's a true legal duty, I'm not sure that any of us want to take on that legal obligation as opposed to a moral obligation. So I think that this is very
things further.
So I want to move to some of the questions. There are so many great questions, and there's one that does relate to what's going on right now in this conversation. I am not a psychiatrist. When I hear a psychiatrist say something about a public figure, I think they're speaking as a psychiatrist. This distinction may be lost on me between a real diagnosis and whatever else it is you're talking about. As a non-psychiatrist, is this distinction too subtle?
I'll take it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, as an observer, it probably is very subtle because diagnostic terminology has become part of ordinary language. And it's not a distinction that the lay public or a journalist or even the public figure being described is meant to ascertain. But in terms of the professional association shaking a finger and laying down the law for its members, it's ridiculous because we who monitor ourselves and are supposed to be having this conversation amongst ourselves do know the difference. So for the APA to tell us it's absolutely reprehensible, that it is unethical for us to ever express concerns about a public figure is deliberately confusing a question that we know how to answer, even if the general public doesn't. So there may be other concerns raised for the general public to hear such things. And the APA has also expressed some of these concerns, such as, like, what is psychiatry all about if we think we can just, put our fingers on our foreheads and ascertain what's going on with someone we've never met? We don't know how to read minds. We're not clairvoyant. We don't know everything there is to know about everything. But we are trained to recognize public behaviors that may be the grounds for concern and that should generate further discussion and further investigation. And that's what we're all talking about here. That's what Mr. Painter is talking about. That's what Dr. Lee is talking about. That's what Mr. Eisen is talking about. And that's what I'm talking about, that conversation should not be shut down. It should be begun because of psychiatrist concerns.
I wonder if I might contrast the psychiatric profession with a neighboring discipline, namely neurology. We've already seen pundits on some cable news networks making remarks about President Biden, whether he is quote unquote losing it or has already lost it. I could imagine that several of the people on this panel would be called upon by cable news networks in the next few months, perhaps during the midterms, to make their own assessment as physicians, as observers, as educated, as learned attorneys. What do you say about that? What's the role of a neurological assessment being made at distance? How does that compare to what we're talking about with regard to psychiatry?
I think it has many of the same problems. So for example, there are probably 10 common things that can cause what appear to be dementing illness. One of them is severe depression. There are within the dementias a whole host of common dementias. Alzheimer, by the way, was a psychiatrist. Freud was a neurologist. You know, I mean, the boundaries around these things are not clear cut. One, you know, when I did geriatric psychiatry evaluations when I was back at Harvard, you know, we would have a whole afternoon with multiple medical records, neurologists, psychiatrists, internists, social workers, you know, MRIs, medical history, et cetera, simply because, making that kind of determination would be problematic without that information. The same thing is true, you know, where I am now at Tufts. That's the way things get done in clinical medicine. So it risks a kind of, you know, judgment. Look, is there some point at which someone has to raise a question about presidential illness and presidential behavior or presidential capacity? Yes, those points are likely to occur and are foreseeable. The question is, how does that then get dealt with? Who deals with it? You know, and I understand Richard's point. You know, he made a determination of what he felt was ethical and important. You know, people can make those comments. Nothing prevents any psychiatrist from commenting on a political figure from a political standpoint. It's the question of whether you're making an ex cathedra pronouncement. That's the concern that I think that I have.
My view on President Trump was not political. It was he violated the Mimes Clause. He's a lawyer. And as a legal ethicist, I said he must make certain divestments. As a professional, even though I voted for his opponent, even though I had also been a Republican for 30 years, I just wonder, why would one profession want to take the professional opinion off the table in these critically important debates? You could have an aging president. Let's think about Ronald Reagan in his second term and the Alzheimer's situation. Now, that was most of that not known by the time he ran for second term. But that's where, in the second term, he forgot about Iran-Contra, if we're to believe his version of the story. These things are relevant, and it may not be as cataclysmic as nuclear war and some of the things many of us feared from Donald Trump. But why not at least encourage some psychiatrists to participate in the conversation, and others can as well, just as we do as legal ethicists in our professional capacity, not our political capacity.
So we've seen, I'm sorry, Dr. Lee, and then Dr. Pouncey.
Yes, I just wanted to say that there comes a time when our duties as a citizen merges with our duties as a professional, in that as citizens, we're expected to contribute our gifts to the good of society. And sometimes those gifts happen to be the psychiatric knowledge that we have. And so, as Dr. Semmergrad was mentioning, that we do have this ground where we have a moral responsibility to society, even if not a legal one. And I believe it is important to point out that there have been instances where psychiatry has colluded with destructive governments. In fact, that was exactly the concern that we raised when the APA changed its Goldwater Rule, its definitions and parameters with the Trump presidency, 2 months after inauguration, not even. And so I believe that psychiatry, like the rest of medicine, has to bring medical neutrality and and professionalism in ways that can help, especially a hyper-partisan environment and where we are losing grounds with truth, science, and reality.
Dr. Pouncey.
I was really enraptured with what you just said, so I think I might have lost my train of thought. But what I wanted to say was just briefly that the difference between psychiatry and neurology is that in neurology, we at least have some concrete ways of testing for cognitive decline and other neurological problems. What makes psychiatry so contentious is that so much of it seems like divination and hand waving and like we're just making things up. And it is an imperfect medical science, but we do have knowledge and we do have bases for our inferences that are tried and true and tested and part of medical science. And psychiatry has such a questionable history, partly because that's only recently true and it's still emerging as a medical science. So it makes psychiatry particularly difficult and particularly untrustworthy to a lot of people. And that is understandable. We are not perfect. We don't read minds. I remind my patients of that all the time, that they got to tell me what they're thinking because I'm not actually psychic, even though I'm a psychiatrist. I'm hilarious.
And we don't talk about it very well in the public sphere. So, I've said for a long time, like, for example, when Steve Jobs got sick, nobody said, oh, poor Steve Jobs, he has a physical illness. We don't use the term physical illness in general. We say they've got a cardiac condition, or they've got atherosclerosis of X, or Steve Jobs had a pancreatic tumor. No, he had a neuroendocrine pancreatic tumor. So again, there's the term mental illness or mentally ill carries, unfortunately, with it a lot of freight and a lot of baggage, which ends up being kind of like a word that's highly stigmatized, and that's not a good position for that to be in, but it's a reality. I think what Richard points out, though, and I think it's a really important point, and Norm points it out as well, we all do, is we have a dilemma, and I think the best way to handle a dilemma is to acknowledge its existence. And the dilemma is that we don't have a good mechanism of evaluating the health and well-being, whether it's a mental disorder of some type or a general medical disorder or any other, of a person who has monarchical powers. You can go back, and this is not new to us. You can just read Shakespeare. Isaac Ray, who was the founder of forensic psychiatry in the United States in 1855, published a very lengthy, book-length review of George III, showing how his doctors hid his illness, and it wasn't until the fourth time that he had whatever he had, not clear, bipolar illness, acute intermittent porphyria, still not established, that a regency was created. So these are real dilemmas that we face as a democracy in dealing with, particularly the president, where there's so much power and so much authority invested, and the Article I branch has somewhat greater difficulty in acting. So I think sitting with dilemmas, to me, is a good solution, rather than assuming that we have simple solutions to very, very difficult problems.
So as the resident philosopher on the panel, I just want to say that dilemmas are by definition unsolvable. This is a problem. It has a solution. Talking about it is a good way to find a solution.
It's a good way to reduce stigma also. Talking, discussion, and education, not silencing.
And as your employee, Nasir Gamey, has so eloquently argued, the fact that the APA wants to stifle the discussion is somewhat stigmatizing in itself. Why can't we talk about mental illness in public figures?
And Nasir remains a professor in my department in excellent standing. Thank you.
I want to give Richard Painter and Norm Eisen an opportunity. I'm particularly interested in the mechanism that could be put in place that Congressman Raskin and others, you and others, have recommended. But Norm Eisen, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to point out that there are some excellent questions. I've just been going through the chat, and I'm reading one now by someone asking, what more evidence could you possibly ask for in order to make an evaluation, given the richness of the public record, and it is so true. It seems to me, as an outside observer, that is an independent question. Congress needs to do its job, but we all need to do our jobs as citizens, and we rely on input from individuals like Dr. Lee in order to make our judgments. That's the essence of democracy. In terms of Congress's job, what Richard and I have advocated is that under the 25th Amendment, Section 4, Congress does have the power to stand up a body to help it make its constitutional assessments as to the capacity of a president when there are medical or psychiatric issues. The ultimate choice is for the Congress. Under the 25th Amendment, you need to have 2/3 of both houses ultimately determining that a president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. But along the way to making that determination, they have the power to pass a statute setting up a commission to help with various of the triggering determinations and evaluations. And it is important that Congress act. We've come through a very narrow escape, and one of the things that we need to do now is take advantage of, so that all the, think of it as belt and suspenders or seat belts and airbags. You would never rely on just one or the other. You never failed to put on your seatbelt because you knew you had an airbag. That would not be a sound practice for a passenger in a vehicle, and it's not a sound practice in a democracy. And we need this additional safeguard. And Richard and I wrote at length about that in a chapter in the second edition of The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, and it's needed.
I would have just add here is the book in which Norm and I wrote that piece, edited by Bandy Lee. I will emphasize, in a free country, we read books, we do not burn books, and we do not fire people from Yale University for editing books. And that's what this is about. And that's why we're here today. And I want to emphasize too that this is not just about the decisions made by Congress under the 25th Amendment, whether pursuant to the default rules in the amendment or the proposed commission that Norm and I suggested that could be established by Congress pursuant to the 25th Amendment. This is about decisions made by others in our government. For example, the question of what should the people in the highest reaches of the Pentagon have done in 1974, in the summer of 74, when Richard Nixon was apparently talking to the paintings on the wall at the White House, if he had ordered a strike against China or Russia. What should they have done? And I don't know the answer to that as a separate question, and that would be a separate panel for this organization. But I would think that relevant to that discussion would be the opinions of mental health experts who, based on whatever information they could obtain, would be able to say something about the mental health of the President of the United States in that very precarious situation in the summer of 1974.
And nothing in the Goldwater Rule would prevent psychiatrists, if they were summoned to the Pentagon or summoned by Congress, as Bandy was, or summoned to a judicial setting, or placed under some other process of law or appropriate authority, from participating in that. And as a matter of fact, it's explicitly in the 2017 ethics opinion that allows that. So that's clear. That's not the issue that psychiatrists are bound and gagged from all circumstances and all settings and all times. It depends on the circumstance, and the circumstances, if done by an appropriate convening authority, would be entirely appropriate. No, nothing would prevent a psychiatrist from serving on a commission of the kind that Steve and I or you and Norm suggested. So again, that there are circumstances that fall outside of that, or that the 25th Amendment is flawed because it depends on the vice president under all circumstances acting, and that's pretty. One can have a lot of skepticism about that. Sure, we have some very real dilemmas, but nothing prevents psychiatrists from participating in that.
But the APA did physically intervene and block us from all the media by calling us unethical armchair psychiatrists. And that actually blocked our ability to educate the public, as Congress members were actually expecting us to do. And additionally, you yourself wrote an article stating that the 25th Amendment was a political process, meaning that no mental health professional should give input beforehand, before Congress members or the cabinet reaches out to us. That's actually untrue, according to the drafter of the 25th Amendment, John Farrick, who has said that physician contribution in order to give data so that the process could proceed were critical, and especially for psychiatric issues. He has said on a number of occasions during conferences that we've shared.
And John has communicated to me personally that in his view, the 25th Amendment was never really established to deal with a relatively difficult psychiatric issue as opposed to more severe medical inability. So look,
that is why he has said that psychiatrists in particular had a contribution to make independently of whether or not we are reached out to beforehand.
Yeah.
I think they're just two different avenues. We serve as consultants, but we also have primary responsibility to society, which we cannot ignore. Just as the preamble to our ethics says, we have a responsibility to patients. Our patients expect us to protect their health and well-being, and we have a responsibility to society. Society also expects us to protect its health and well-being.
Well, I think we have very much joined the issue with 3 or 4 minutes left.
Can I just say one thing
about a healthy
about
discussion? Richard Painter, what do you want to give us a last word?
Very quickly about the nuclear situation in the summer of '74. I don't believe the nuclear launch manual, the instructions to the Department of Defense would instruct those responsible for the launch to call psychiatrists and get an expert opinion. If you wait until you're called, if that is the vision of the psychiatric profession's role in our democracy, that call may never come. And you're looking at that mushroom crowd. That's what this is about. Do we care just about our own discipline and protecting ourselves from accusations of politicization, which of course all of us are subject to? I am as a lawyer. I've been called all sorts of things because I opined on Donald Trump. But am I here to protect just myself as a lawyer and my reputation in a narrow profession, or to be a citizen and to help protect my own country?
Yeah, of course, one has broad responsibilities as a citizen. I would again suggest that we are attributing powers to psychiatrists, either in small numbers or large numbers, that unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your point of view, we probably don't have. We have a more profound political problem, and we have a more profound social problem than probably many of us recognized 5 or 6 years ago. Maybe some did, maybe others not. And I think it's going to take more than just simply looking to psychiatrists to play a particular ex parte kind of role here to deal with these kinds of problems. Do we have expertise to bring? Absolutely. So do a lot of other citizens who can see things clearly with their own eyes.
Well, as a philosopher, I have no worries about not being taken seriously. I think once in a century, somebody listens to a philosopher. Look, I'm sorry, Norman, we probably have to wrap it up.
Speak for yourself, Jonathan.
I have a feeling this will not be the last opportunity. Dr. Pouncey qualifies both as a psychiatrist and a philosopher, so I'm totally confused. Steve Zanakis, do you want to say a last word? As I very much
Well,
think
I'd really like to thank
fabulous
everybody
discussion.
for having just a really robust conversation here and all the contributions that everybody made. I think that a very important takeaway is that this conversation should continue. And I hope that particularly we can help it continue at CERL. I think it's vitally important for all the things that people said. It's not going to go away, and therefore we should continue to examine it carefully, shine some light on it, and do our best work, because that's really what's made our country strong and keeps it going. So really thanks off and salute to all of you for participating today, to all our participants and the great questions that they've asked. And please engage. And we welcome you to any other of all our other future conferences and panels. And Jonathan.
And we both apologize for not getting to so many of your questions, but this is to be continued. I am reminded of a Penn historian who's no longer alive, a great historian of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, who said, you know, the founders were able to figure out the legislature, they were able to figure out the judiciary, they never quite were able to figure out the presidency. It was a long, hot summer. They had to go back to their plantations and farms and grocery stores. They hadn't seen their families in months. They were tired. So it now falls on us, all these years later, to try to sort out these problems. Thank you so much. Very much grateful to the panel. And thanks to everybody who sent in questions. Next time, we hope we'll get to them.
And we'll have recordings available.
And the recordings will be available.
Yes.
Thanks to all.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.